Hello and welcome to the spring technical update on potato late blight from Corteva Agriscience. My name is Craig Chisholm, and over the next few minutes I'll take you through the findings from 2024 and look ahead to 2025. So you'll note from the agenda that we'll have a look at the blight challenge that we set out with at 2024 and how that's evolved. And then how we're going to manage that in 2025. And then I will just touch on a little bit about Titus, our post-emergence herbicide, where there are a few changes that you should be aware of as we go into 2025. So beginning with the sort of quick hit, which is Titus. It's been around for a few years now and is arguably the most broad-ranging and flexible post-em herbicide available for use in potatoes. It can be used on all varieties, excluding seed, because you can get some transitory mottling of the leaves, which can mask virus. So that's why it's not available to use on seed crops. It's effective against both broadleaf weeds and grasses. And the broadleaf weed spectrum can be broadened by mixing with metribuzin, but clearly that can only be on varieties which are metribuzin tolerant. The new information, which I referred to on the agenda, is that Vivolt has been added to the Titus label as the approved adjuvant for use with it. That replaces Citowet, which had been on the label previously, but is no longer available in the UK, and therefore we needed to ensure there was a new adjuvant available on the label. And just bear in mind that if you are including Blue N in tank mix, that is not compatible with Vivolt. So you may not mix Blue N with Titus and Vivolt. So looking now at the weed list for Titus, you can see that it's quite a lengthy one, both for broadleaf weeds and for grasses. You'll notice too that the Titus weeds are indicated with an S, a susceptible rating, and there are a range of weeds there that you'll see as moderately susceptible or moderately resistant. And obviously in those instances where you are able to add metribuzin to the mix on the variety that you're going into, then obviously that will move that rating into the susceptible or moderately susceptible category. So turning now to our main topic, late blight in potatoes. This gives us a picture of the late blight population which we faced at the outset of the 2024 season. You can see that the UK population was dominated by EU36 and EU6, neither of which displays any resistance to fungicides, but are just generally fit and resilient and therefore tend to dominate the population. There are some instances of samples being sent in of EU13, which shows resistance to metalaxyl, and EU37, which shows resistance to fluazinam, though that has declined since its height in 2017, probably through a decline in the use of fluazinam. There are still some undefined blight strains out there, predominantly in the north of the country. All in all, though, it's broadly the same population that we've had for the last 3 to 4 years. However, we can't just look at the breakdown of late blight within our own border, and we do need to be aware of what's on our doorstep. In this case, that being Northern Europe, the Low Countries, the Netherlands, the Nordics, and Ireland. CA resistance had developed in the Nordics back in 22, and it was found in the strain EU43. This strain then spread gradually south and west, and when it came into the Low Countries in the very high disease pressure year of 2023, it was exposed to very high levels of use of OSBPIs, which is Zorvec plus benthiovalicard, which is a CAA. Now, that resulted in the further development of resistance to OSBPIs within the EU43 population in that region. It's interesting to note, therefore, that OSBPI or Zorvec resistance did not develop in the area where this strain developed in the Nordics, predominantly due to a different strategy with how fungicides were being used. And there's a learning there which we will discuss further in this topic. Just to highlight, there is a purple patch that you can see in the Benelux region there, which is EU46, which also has developed resistance to OSBPI fungicides, so to Zorvec. So it's something to be aware of when we are embarking on the 2024 season. And as a result, we brought in a set of best practice recommendations, which we'll cover next. So having recognized the challenge on our doorstep, Corteva set about developing a series of principles of best practice, which went beyond the label recommendations and would look to ensure that Zorvec continued to perform at the high level that users had experienced to date. To this end, growers and agronomists were asked to ensure that Zorvec was applied in strict alternation with effective chemistry of a different mode of action, other than a CAA, that being because the partner product in Zorvec Entecta was a CAA compound, benthiovalicard, the others being mandipropamid or dimetamorph. It was also required that Zorvec should be applied on a strict 7-day spray interval rather than running any longer. In curative situations, so when blight is active in the area where the crop is growing, a curative active of a non-OSBPI origin should be included. So the two that were given as examples here are cymoxanil or propamacarb. I think evidence now indicates that potassium phosphonates would also offer useful curative activity. Zorvec should not exceed 20% of the total number of sprays applied to the crop. So anything less than a 15 spray program would only have 2 Zorvec applications within it. If the number of applications is 15 sprays or more, then that could increase to a total of 3 sprays, but users were required not to exceed that regardless of the number of sprays, and certainly while mancozeb is available, to include it at frequent intervals. So the same principles were applied to seed crops, with the additional stipulation that where Zorvec is being applied to a seed crop or a crop grown for seed, a curative fungicide partner be included of a non-OSBPI origin. The example here being given is cymoxanil. And while Zorvec should also not exceed 20% of the total number of sprays, on most seed crops that will probably mean only one Zorvec being applied. On rare occasions that may stretch to 2, but should not exceed that. I would certainly then also refer you to the Corteva Best Practice Guide, which will take you to the website where all that will be laid out for 2025. So now we come to look at what we actually faced in 2024. It was, without doubt, a very significant high pressure year. You can see the heavy red line there indicating it to be the fourth toughest blight year since records here began in 1988. Indeed, first samples came from Cornwall and then from Suffolk and Norfolk into GHI very early in the season. Fight against blight was extremely useful in characterizing the challenge in real time. Samples kept on coming in the face of lower warning incidents from Fight Against Blight and Blight Spy as was. I think that was driven predominantly by unharvested crops from the difficult harvesting period in 2023, which created a sea of volunteers, which obviously would help carry the epidemic over from 2022. Also having a difficult planting season meant that probably dumps were not dealt with in quite as timely a manner as they have done in a normal year, and that just added to the pressure. And then once the epidemic is up and running, it's just a numbers game and it's very hard to hold. And even if the weather conditions look less favourable for the pathogen, often in the canopy of a crop, the conditions will be much more conducive, and therefore the epidemic continues to run. Certainly that was seen in the demand for more curative actives in the shape of propamicarbs, amoxanil and potassium phosphonates from quite early in the season. So now we'll have a look at how late blight programs held up in the face of such an epidemic. In trials, Zorvec and Option were applied strictly in accordance with labels and Corteva best practice guidance. You can see the aerial image here shows a site in West Wales that was visited on the 16th of August, and you can clearly see the untreated and some of the weaker programs that were applied there. Natural infection was what drove the epidemic here, which was EU6, and it came into the trial from mid-July. And the key thing to highlight is that the Zorvec containing programs were the most robust on the site, and that reflected grower and agronomist experience out in the real world, shall we say, in commercial crops, where indeed we had no instances of any issues arising where Zorvec performance was any less than it's been since its introduction some 5 years ago. Looking now at the data from the site at Lampeter with RSK ADAS, you can see the red line, which accelerates very quickly from mid-July, is the untreated. And as you would have hoped, the fungicide programs then delayed the onset of disease to varying degrees. The black line is the program which contained no Zorvec treatments, and as you can see, it broke somewhat earlier than those where Zorvec was included. Now remember, the Zorvec was applied strictly in accordance with best practice guidance. So the solid purple line had 2 applications of Zorvec Entecta in it at T2 and T4, and the thinner dotted line had the same 2 applications of Zorvec Entecta, but at T3 and T5. And it looks as though you would, from this graph, that you would apply your Zorvec at T3 and T5. But of course, that then is just how the treatments in the protocol played out relative to how the epidemic was developing. And indeed, at other sites, they would have been inverted because of the way the situation with the blight epidemic at the time of those applications. The dashed line that you can see in the middle, that looks as though it is going to stay at the lowest level of disease had it pushed on beyond the 10th of September, had a third Zorvec Entecta applied as part of the 20% that we were allowed within the program, applied in the stable canopy phase, and that indeed did play out to prove to be the most effective over time. So turning now from Wales to the site that we had up in Ayrshire at SRUC, also in King Edward, and you can see from the photographs here that the weather was somewhat challenging in August, and it was indeed very wet. And you can see the untreated is now just black sticks. The non-Zorvec standard has got some quite clear blight strikes in it, and any program which had Zorvec in it was a marked improvement over those without. Looking at the data, it's laid out and marked in exactly the same way as it was previously. You can see that the lines are a little less steep than they were in Wales, which is a reflection of the cooler conditions and the slightly slower progress of the late blight epidemic. But it was nonetheless dramatic, because it certainly reached 100%, but not quite in the same time frame as it did in Lampeter. What you can see is the red line indicating the untreated is moving away and up towards 100%, certainly by the early to mid-August, and the black line again indicates the non-Zorvec containing program, and you can see that that started to break quite early from the sort of second week in August onwards, and then the Zorvec treatments, or the programs I should say, that contained Zorvec really only started to break and see the first lesions appearing some 2 to 3 weeks later, depending on the timing when Zorvec was included in the program. And remember, the applications would have been applied in very early July, and it's the hangover from that Zorvec and reducing the amount of inoculum within the crop, and it's the persistence of the product which is helping to maintain that blight-free leaf until we start to see it begin to break in mid to late August. The benefit here, again, of the two applications, it's interesting to note that the timings are somewhat inverted over what they were in Wales, which is what I alluded to in the last slide. Indeed, again, the third application being included in the stable canopy phase, because it was still within the 20%, does prove beneficial, but I'm afraid that the crop ran out of steam before we were able to let that really play out in the data. Having established that Zorvec activity has continued at the level which we have enjoyed to date in 2024 across the UK and Ireland, both in trials and in commercial crops. What has changed within the late blight population that we need to be aware of as we stand on the cusp of the 2025 season? Indeed, probably the first thing of note is the colour change which you see in the map on the left here, which indicates the rise of EU36 in the Low Countries. This is something has replaced the EU43 and to a degree 46, which we had seen at the outset of 2024, and as probably a reflection of the widespread adoption of best practice in this area, which has meant that the more aggressive, the fitter strains are going to start to predominate in terms of the samples that are being tested, having been submitted for analysis. When we look at the UK in the map in the middle here, the colours look broadly similar to what we saw at the outset of 2024, reflecting that while it was a tough year and there were a lot of samples submitted, in excess of 1,600 to fight against blight, the breakdown is still dominated by EU 36 and EU 6, which are the fitter strains within the UK population. There's still a smattering of EU 13 and one EU 37, and we've picked up again after a couple of years where it hasn't been seen a bit of EU 41, which I understand has resistance to metalaxyl as it's the mutation that it carries. The thing probably of greatest interest is the two samples of EU46, which had not been picked up in the UK before. Picked up one in Wales and one in the northeast of Scotland, and indeed analysis of those confirmed that they do carry a mutation which shows resistance to OSBPI, so to Zorvec as such. Now, I will then go on and discuss that at greater length on the next slide. Looking now at the fight against blight sample analysis from 2024, there were 1,600 plus samples submitted, a reflection of the severity of the blight epidemic that we experienced, 1,000 plus of which have now been genotyped, and as far as I can see, broadly in the same proportion as we embarked on the season in 2024. Still no EU43 found in the UK, which is a good sign, a sign that best practice appears to be working for us. The reappearance of EU41 is interesting, but maybe not so surprising considering that it had been found previously. And as I say, only two samples of EU46 were found right at the very tail end of the season as crops were either already at burn down or very close to it. The one in Wales was first picked up and sent in early September. It's in a field in a predominantly livestock grassland area, and indeed the crop was burnt down very soon after the sample was taken for submission. And the one in Scotland was a full month later, probably one of the last fields in the UK to still have any green tissue, and was sampled literally just ahead of burn down, which was within hours of the sample being taken. In neither case was Zorvec use linked with the arrival or development of OSBPI resistance. Every precaution to prevent the potential for tuber infection and further spread has been taken, and any volunteers emerging in 2025 are to be sprayed off as soon as they appear. Just to reiterate then, in a tough season, there have been no failures to control late blight with a robust fungicide strategy based on mixing and alternating different modes of action across the programme. There's some encouraging news in that EU36 and EU6 continue to dominate the population at the end of the 2024 season as they did at the outset, with no big changes in the UK Phytophthora infestans population. It's good to see that EU43 has not been found in the UK or indeed spread further in Ireland, suggesting that best practice has been broadly effective. The two samples of EU46 submitted under Fight Against Blight are, however, a clear warning, a canary in the mineshaft, if you like, that UK growers and agronomists must stick to best practice in order to maintain the efficacy of all the fungicide modes of action available in the UK toolbox. So just looking ahead to developing our fungicide program against late blight in 2025, there are a number of factors that we need to consider. Firstly, the late blight population. There's been no large-scale shift in Phytophthora infestans population in the UK, certainly according to the analysis of the Fight Against Blight samples that were submitted. As far as guidance and advice that should influence fungicide choice, there are a number of factors that we should avail ourselves with about the products which are available in the UK market, those being the chemical group and mode of action that each belongs to, such that we can construct a viable program where we are alternating modes of action between applications. We need to make sure that we use preventative, curative and systemic properties of the fungicides that are available to us at the appropriate time within the program. And we need to make sure that we follow label and, probably more importantly, best practice supplementary advice, which comes with a number of fungicides available to us to ensure that we do not select for resistance within the Phytophthora infestans population in the UK. In 2024, manufacturer, research institutes, FRAG UK advice was all aligned and was broadly followed, with users mixing and alternating modes of actions effectively, and that maintained that no instance of field breakdown to fungicide resistance was reported. Zorvec Entecta was indeed an invaluable tool in a tough late blight season. One of the two very tail end of season samples of EU46 which were submitted under Fight Against Blight, they were not linked to the use of Zorvec or OSBPI fungicides, and indeed careful management will minimize the potential for any carryover into 2025. Advice for 2025 will have only minor updates from that of 2024. A couple of additional points to consider for 2025 over that employed in 24. I would certainly think about including a curative non-OSBPI active ingredient in mixtures between timings 1 and 3, particularly where I have imported seed from outside of the UK. That should ensure a nice clean start and make sure that the blight epidemic we are dealing with is the one which we finished 2024 with. Early sampling under Fight Against Blight and the turnaround of that analysis will also provide certain reassurance in the same vein, and all stakeholders should be encouraged to take part in that program. So that brings us to the best practice advice for 2025 from Corteva Agriscience. It's broadly the same as it was in 2024, except where you can see the blue text there in bullet point 1. So Zorvec should be applied in strict alternation with effective chemistry of a different mode of action other than QIIs, i.e. amisulbrom or cyazofamid containing products. Zorvec Entecta is co-formulated with amisulbrom, and therefore to adhere to strict alternation, QII should not precede or follow the application of Zorvec Entecta. Point 2 there is an indication that Zorvec should be applied on a strict 7-day spray interval, or as near to as can be achieved. And if there's active blight in the area, then Zorvec should be applied in tank mix with a partner fungicide with a curative active ingredient of a different mode of action. So that would be something like cymoxanil or propamacarb. Zorvec sprays should not exceed 20% of the total number of applications within the program. So generally that would be 2 applications unless your program is 15 sprays or more, in which case it could be up to 3 applications. And whilst mancozeb is still available, Corteva Agriscience would certainly encourage its use and inclusion at regular intervals. As far as seed crops are concerned, there is no change from that advice issued in 2024. So Zorvec should be mixed with a non-OSBPI curative fungicide, an example of that being cymoxanil, when applied to seed crops. As with ware crops, Zorvec should not exceed 20% of the total number of sprays, and given that total number tends to be less than on ware crops, generally that is most likely to be 1 Zorvec application, but certainly not exceeding 2. And I would encourage following the link to the Corteva best practice guidance, which will take you to the key page on our website. And finally, just a short reminder about option. It obviously contains cymoxanil, which is locally systemic, offering both preventative and genuinely curative activity. It will provide kickback of between 1 and up to 2 days. And while relatively short-lived in the plant, so may not be applied alone and must always be included in mixture, it will bring curative activity to a purely protectant fungicide and bring an alternative mode of action to protect single active ingredient fungicides. With option, it can be applied up to 8 times within your program, and it has a 1-day harvest interval.